Hello and welcome back to the APUS History Curriculum for Era 6. In this video, we will be looking at Topic 6.7, Labor in the Gilded Age. We will continue our look at socioeconomic changes, and the things that stayed the same as well, due to the growth of industrial capitalism in this time period. Note that the learning objective associated with this topic is the same as the one from the last topic. So let's get to it. The industrialization of the Northeast dramatically changed the social structure of America. New wealth abounded with the growth of factories, railroads, banks, and others. Urban areas were becoming increasingly common, with hundreds of small cities and at least 38 with populations greater than 100,000, and 3 with a population bigger than 1 million, New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia. And most of these cities were heavily involved in manufacturing. Most came to have a complex class structure that was based on a combination of wealth, the more the better, occupation, with the learned professions at the top, and family status, the older the better. The richest 10% of Americans controlled 75% of the wealth at the end of the Gilded Age, which had tripled over the course of that time period. In 2013, this number was actually almost the same, with the top 10% controlling 74% of the wealth. Now, the wealthy, representing the smallest percentage of Americans, lived lavish lifestyles. They considered themselves America's royalty and settled for nothing less than estates worthy of that distinction. In addition to living in opulent homes, they dined on succulent food and showered their children with a variety of gifts. They filled their lavish homes with expensive works of art and elaborate decor. Upper-class women of the Gilded Age have been compared to dolls on display who flaunted their wealth and continually sought to improve their status in society. Still, some wealthy Gilded Age women engaged in social activism, charitable work, and fought for equality, including the right to vote through women's suffrage groups. Some created homes for destitute immigrants, while others pushed a temperance agenda, believing the source of poverty in most family troubles was alcohol. We'll look more at that in a future video. In another trend, beginning in the 1870s, American girls with money flocked to Britain particularly, ready to exchange this industrial cash that their families had obtained, and stocks, for a title in the British peerage. By the end of the 19th century, it cost more to run a country estate than the state could make for itself, and the great houses of Europe, especially Britain, were starting to fall into disrepair. By marrying one of these so-called dollar princesses, a future duke would get access to cash that could ensure not just the survival of his family's land and name, but also a wealthy lifestyle. By the early 20th century, though, this practice was ending, but it had been a practice that was unique to the wealthy in America. A substantial middle class did not emerge in America until the middle decades of the 19th century. Before that time, there were what were sometimes called middling folks, small farmers, skilled workers or artisans, shopkeepers, and the like. These middling folks were of modest means compared to the elite citizens of their day. By the middle of the 19th century, however, pressures of industrialization had begun slowly to dissolve this group. As businesses grew larger and more complex, specializing in different functions, local manufacturers and home-based businesses were replaced by companies and corporations. As firms grew in size and complexity, they began to separate manual laborers from clerks and other non-manual workers who handled paperwork and sales, among other duties. At first, they simply worked in separate rooms, but as cities became more spatially specialized, they increasingly worked in completely separate locations. Over time, this distinction between manual and non-manual labor became the key indicator of 19th century class status. By the 1890s, these workers increasingly inhabited separate social worlds as cities became segregated by class. And doctors, lawyers, scientists, engineers, those with college educations, were grouped into this class. Land grants to establish colleges and universities were becoming more commonplace. As more colleges were being established, therefore more people within this group were encouraged to attend college. The increasing wealth of the middle class allowed them to purchase larger residences, separating themselves from the homes of the masses, with multiple rooms for different activities. In these new contexts, a particular kind of middle-class domestic ideal began to emerge, altering gender roles and strategies of child nurturing and education. Perhaps most importantly, children were given greater amounts of formal schooling, a crucial tactic intended to help them secure positions in the expanding non-manual workforce. And this was both for boys and girls, because opportunities for women to expand their education, to attend college, was also on the rise. Although, again, this is still only for upper and middle class women. Colleges like Mount Holyoke, Smith, Vassar, Bryn Mawr, they provided a liberal arts education, equivalent to that of the male-only counterparts. By 1910, 40% of the nation's college students were female, and nearly half of the nation's colleges accept women, despite the fact that many professions were actually still closed to them. But as women slowly became more educated and independent, traditional Victorian values were challenged. New jobs were available in the city, especially for single women. Demands for various reforms, like prohibition of alcohol, the regulation of child labor, and the right to vote, were brought into the public discourse by educated women of both the upper and middle class. The working class was also significantly changed by industrialization. At the beginning of the 19th century, farming was still the dominant occupation, and there were few wage laborers. But by the end of the century, wage labor emerged as the definitive working class experience. The conditions of industrial work involved really more than a third of the population by 1900, and it kept growing. In factories, the skills of artisans were broken down into separate operations, allowing the hiring of much less skilled workers, keeping wages low and threatening workers' independence on the worksite. By 1886, an estimated 75% of the labor force was either semi or unskilled. Furthermore, working-class labor was often dirty and backbreaking, very difficult. And the unpredictability of the economy made things even worse, since there were numerous financial panics that led to depressions. And that often meant a loss of jobs. In fact, as much as 20% of the population could not find regular work, and businesses frequently failed. Sometimes as high as 90% of businesses failed in any given year. By 1890, about 45% of workers lived below the poverty line, which was then probably around $500 a year. And it was extremely difficult, if not virtually impossible, to move up from one class to another. Eventually, laborers realized that they must unite to demand change. They may have lacked money, education, and political power, but there was the obvious fact that there were simply more workers than there were owners. The Knights of Labor had existed as a secret society of workers, secret because it wanted to protect its members from employer retaliation. But they wanted to involve more people, believing that both workers and shopkeepers could benefit, and proposed a system to replace capitalism even. Under the leadership of Terence Powderly, the group abandoned secrecy and emerged to embrace the use of strikes, often large-scale ones, to achieve their goals. After the railway strike of 1877, membership in the Knights of Labor would grow tremendously. Speaking of that strike, the railroad strike of 1877 was the first interstate strike in American history, and it resulted from the financial panic of 1873, during which railroad companies drastically cut wages. Unorganized railroad workers for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad went on strike that year after receiving a 10% wage cut, which was actually the second wage cut since the panic had begun in 1873. They essentially stopped the movement of 4 Eastern Rail trunk lines, which caused turmoil in every industrial center. At the request of the governor of West Virginia, President Rutherford Hayes sent federal forces to protect the railroad, the first use of soldiers in a labor matter, justifying his actions on the ground of the need to protect the mail. Demonstrations soon expanded to other cities and resulted in general strikes well beyond the company and location where it started. Violence even broke out in cities across the nation. in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Martinsburg, West Virginia, Chicago, Illinois. The Great Strike of 1877 sparked battles between militias and the crowds of workers. Pittsburgh would be the scene of the greatest loss of life and property damage. The workers, though, were eventually forced to give up and held resentment of Hayes for his actions. More than 100,000 workers had gone on strike during this dispute, shutting down nearly half of the nation's rail systems. When the strike had ended, over 100 people had been killed, and 1,000 more were imprisoned, plus millions of dollars of damage had been caused to rail lines, cars, and roundhouses. 1886 was a year marked by 1,600 strikes, some of them quite violent, as well as the deadly Haymarket riot in Chicago. That incident was related to a strike against the McCormick Harvesting Machine Company that was part of a national union campaign to get an 8-hour workday. On May 3rd of that year, one person was killed and several were injured as police intervened to protect strikebreakers and intimidate the striking workers. To protest police brutality, labor leaders called for a mass meeting the next day in Haymarket Square. Some were anarchists who believed that any form of government was abusive, controlled by the rich to exploit the poor. It wasn't uncommon for labor unions during the late 19th century to push for the abolition of government in order to achieve their goals. But after most of the demonstrators had departed this meeting, a contingent of police arrived and demanded that the remaining crowd disperse. At that point, a bomb was thrown into a crowd of police officers, and the police responded with random gunfire. 7 police officers were killed, and 60 others were wounded before the violence ended. Civilian casualties have been estimated at somewhere between 4 and 8 dead and 30 to 40 injured. This Haymarket riot created widespread hysteria directed against both immigrants and labor leaders. Amid the panic, 8 were tried and convicted of murder on the grounds that they had conspired with or aided an unknown assailant, even though the bomb thrower was never positively identified. Their alleged involvement was never really proven, but 4 were hanged on November 11, 1887. And the Knights of Labor were deemed guilty by association, and soon thereafter its membership dwindled. Also in 1886, 25 skilled workers' organizations joined together to create the American Federation of Labor, or AFL. It was established as a group of independent craft unions by Samuel Gompers. Each member union would have exclusive control of their craft, rather than giving up control to a larger organization like the Knights of Labor had done. Unlike its predecessor, the AFL did not focus on national political issues. Instead, it concentrated on gaining things like the right to bargain collectively for wages, benefits, hours, and working conditions. Led by Samuel Gompers, the AFL allowed only skilled workers as their members, and very gradually emerged as the preeminent union in the United States. Unskilled workers, as well as minorities and women, were largely left out. The Homestead Strike in Homestead, Pennsylvania, pitted one of the most powerful corporations, Carnegie Steel Company, against the nation's strongest trade union, the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers. An 1889 strike had won the steel workers a favorable 3-year contract, but by 1892, Carnegie was determined to break the union. His plant manager, Henry Clay Frick, increased production demands, and when the union refused to accept the new conditions, Frick began locking the workers out of the plant. That year, the union went on strike at Carnegie's Homestead Works near Pittsburgh, and when the negotiations broke down, Frick shut down the mill, installed 3 miles of wooden fence topped with barbed wire, and hired 300 guards supplied by the Pinkerton Detective Agency. The guards were placed aboard 2 company barges in Pittsburgh for the trip up the river to nearby Homestead. On July 6, the guards were confronted by hundreds of workers and townsfolk. In the gun battle that ensued, 7 workers and 3 Pinkerton guards were killed. 12 hours after the battle for Homestead began, the guards surrendered. The Union's victory, though, didn't last long. Within days, 8,500 members of the National Guard arrived and took control of the plant. When Frick was seriously wounded in an assassination attempt in his Pittsburgh office, public opinion turned against the Steelworkers Union. By November of that year, the union had been broken, and the mill had reopened as a non-union plant, using primarily Eastern European and African American workers. Union leaders were blacklisted from the steel industry. At the time, unskilled mill workers, who were mainly Eastern European immigrants, made less than $1.70 for a 12-hour workday. Skilled workers had earned between $4 and $7.60 a day. In a final example of significant union actions during the Gilded Age, we look at the Pullman Palace Car Company, which manufactured the sleeping cars used by most of the nation's railroads. Now, 1894 was the second of 4 years of depression, and despite massive railroad expansion, even the Pullman Company was being affected. So the owner, George Pullman, responded by laying off several thousand of his 5,800 employees and cutting the pay for the rest between 25 and 50%. But he refused to reduce the rents that were charged to employees who lived in the company town of Pullman, near Chicago. Then he fired 3 members of a workers' grievance committee. So on May 11, 1894, 90% of his workers went on strike. The strike spread nationwide when the American Railway Union refused to move any trains that had Pullman cars attached. Within a month, more than 250,000 other railroad employees had joined the strike. This Pullman strike paralyzed the economies of 27 states. By mid-July, Midwest railway lines were stuck with cars on tracks that no one would touch. The government, under President Grover Cleveland, actually got a court injunction ordering strikers back to work, citing federal authority to deliver the mail, which at the time was done by train. When they refused to comply, he sent more than 14,000 federal troops to try and force them. In Chicago, soldiers fired into a crowd of 10,000, killing 25 people and leaving 60 badly injured. Property damage exceeded $80 million. Hundreds of people were jailed, including Union leader Eugene Debs, who subsequently founded the Socialist Party. Railroad attorney Clarence Darrow, seeing what was going on, switched sides and defended Debs, launching his career as a defender of underdogs. Debs pleaded for all American workers to strike to protest the involvement of the government on the side of management. But it didn't happen. And Samuel Gompers and his fellow craft unionists at the American Federation of Labor refused to even consider the idea, showing that there was a growing division within the labor movement, especially between skilled and unskilled workers. The labor force in general, the working class, was largely made up of city dwellers, new immigrants, and even farm workers who were increasingly being displaced by mechanization. With such a large population available to work in America's growing factories, and workers increasingly separated from owners, there was little power that a single worker had over their wages or even their pace of work. Big businesses used the courts and political influence to resist attempts by workers to improve their situation. Anyone who participated in efforts to improve labor conditions were frequently fired and sometimes prevented from working again, even for other companies. In some cases, employers even controlled where their workers lived, where they shopped, and even what they could spend their money on, taking their influence far beyond the factory floor. For most industrial workers, wages were well below what would be considered a comfortable standard of living, and the working class suffered the most whenever there were financial panics and depressions. For example, following both the panics of 1873 and 1893, the working class saw their wages negatively affected. Interestingly, though, because of the rise of mass production of goods, prices on many common items actually decreased. So even though the wages of the working class were low, and in some cases getting lower, they typically were still higher than they had been a decade or two earlier, which meant this working class could still afford more goods and services than they had ever had before. Essentially, even though the gap between the rich and the poor was growing during this period, Many Americans, most Americans, even the working class, saw their overall standards of living actually go up. To make up for low wages, though, many families had no choice but to send their children to work in factories and mills. This was especially prevalent in the South, where wages were 1/3 to 1/2 of what wages were in the North. Only 6 states had compulsory education laws at this point, and most were for only several weeks a year, so it's not like children were being pulled out of school in violation of any laws. In fact, in 1870, about half of the nation's children received no formal education whatsoever. Although many states did provide for a free public education for children, economic realities kept many of them working in mines and factories or on the farm. 10, 12, even 14-hour days were not uncommon for both adults and even for children. Businesses actually sometimes preferred to hire child laborers because they could be paid at much lower rates than adults, often with several children collectively making the same as one adult. Even though their speed or quantity of work was likely less, it wouldn't have been that huge of a difference. The photographs you see here depict children working in cotton mills, oyster processing factories, as newspaper sellers, in cotton fields, and in a cigar factory. And note, there was generally no laws regarding child labor until significantly into the 20th century. Well, that about covers what you need to know for topic 6.7, Labor in the Gilded Age. Be sure to keep up with your reading, and I'll catch you in the next video.